At 2 in the morning, my daughter collapsed in my vineyard rows, soaked in rain, 3 ribs broken. Before she passed out, she said 4 words that changed everything I thought I knew about the family she married into. His brother is alive. A man the Ashfords buried 9 years ago was about to bring their entire empire down, and I was the one who had to find him first. I didn't know any of that yet. I only knew Naomi was on the ground between row 14 and row 15, and that the sound she made when I touched her side was not a sound I had ever heard a human being make. My name is Desmond Okafor. I am 62 years old. I have spent 4 decades reading dirt for a living, and that night, the dirt told me nothing. Because dirt cannot tell you your daughter has been lying to you for 2 years, to keep you safe from a truth she was drowning in alone. I got my arms under her and carried her across the gravel to the porch light. Her left eye had already swollen past recognition. There was a mark on her wrist, perfectly circular, raised and red, the kind that does not happen by accident. I set her in the kitchen chair closest to the lamp and made myself look. 3 ribs, maybe 4, judging by how she held her arm. A cut on her lip that had healed wrong once already and been reopened. "Julian," I said, not a question. She shook her head, and that single motion told me more than a full confession would have. Not Julian. Someone worse, or something worse, and I did not have the shape of it yet. "Dad." Her voice came out broken in the middle, like a board that's been stepped on wrong. "Don't call anyone yet. Please. Not until I explain." I had spent 2 years accepting her short phone calls and her careful answers, and telling myself that was just marriage, that was just distance, that was just a daughter growing up and needing less of her father than she used to. I had told myself a great many comfortable lies. I was done with all of them by the time I got the kettle on. "Explain," I said. She pulled a phone from her coat pocket. Not her phone. A prepaid one, cracked screen case, still wet from the rain. She set it on the table between us like it weighed more than the both of us combined. "There's a man," she said. "Julian's brother. Elias." "Elias is dead," I said. "I stood at his funeral, Naomi. 9 years ago. I shook your father-in-law's hand at the reception. I know what you saw." She was shaking now, not from cold. "I know what everyone saw. He's not dead, Dad. He never died. And 3 days ago, Micah started talking to him." I did not understand the sentence. I want to be honest about that. For 1 full second, my brain simply refused the information the way it refuses most things that would require me to rebuild everything I thought I knew about a family I had watched my daughter marry into. "Micah is 8. I said like that settled something. "I need you to tell me what you actually know," I said. "Not what you think. What you know." I know Elias Ashford was Cormac's oldest son, and I know he was going to inherit everything. And I know 6 months before the funeral, he stood up at a family dinner and told his father he wasn't going to help buy out 3 more farms on the valley floor. She pressed her good hand flat against the table like she needed it to stay still. I know he disappeared for 2 weeks after that. And I know when they found the truck at the bottom of the ravine off Mill Creek Road, there wasn't a body in it. They said the river took him. Cormac gave him a closed casket funeral for a man they never recovered, and everyone in this town went along with it because Cormac Ashford asked them to. "You went along with it too," I said. "You married into that family 2 years later." I didn't know then what I know now. Her voice cracked flat, not loud. "Nobody talks about Elias in that house, Dad. Not once in 5 years. Not his name, not his birthday, nothing. I thought it was grief. I understand now, it was something closer to fear. Micah has an app on his tablet. For drawing. Julian's father bought it for him. Somebody's been messaging him through it for weeks, teaching him to draw vineyard rows the right way. telling him things only someone who grew up on that land would know. Naomi's good eye found mine. Dad, I think it's Elias. And I think Cormac doesn't know yet, but he will. And when he does, I don't think Micah is safe in that house anymore. The kettle started to whistle. I did not move to answer it. The mark on your wrist, I said. That's not from tonight. That's older. 2 weeks, she said. It happened 2 weeks ago. I told the emergency room I burned it on the stove. She looked at it the way you look at something that belongs to a stranger. Tonight was the ribs. Tonight was because Micah showed me a message on the tablet before he went to bed, and I made the mistake of asking Julian about it in front of his father. Who did this to you? I said. Tonight. Give me a name. She looked at the burn mark on her own wrist, like it belonged to someone else. That's the part you're not going to want to hear first, she said. Because it isn't Julian's father. It's Julian. Julian Ashford had never raised a hand to his wife in 5 years of marriage. And I believed that completely, right up until the moment I stopped believing it, which took exactly as long as it took my daughter to say 4 more words. He didn't want to. I want to be clear about what I heard in that sentence, because I have turned it over more times than I can count since that night. She did not say he didn't do it. She said he didn't want to. There is a canyon of difference between those 2 claims, and my daughter was standing at the bottom of it with 3 broken ribs. Explain that to me, I said. My voice came out flatter than I intended. Cormac was in the room, Naomi said. He told Julian to handle it. That's the phrase he uses, handle it. And Julian looked at me like he was asking permission to not do what his father told him, and I could see him lose that argument in about 4 seconds, and then he crossed the room. I sat with that. The kettle had gone quiet behind me. Forgotten water cooling toward useless. 4 seconds, I said. I've watched him lose that argument before, she said. Smaller versions of it. A raised voice instead of a raised hand. Cormac says something, Julian's face does something, and then Julian does whatever keeps his father calm. I told myself for 2 years that meant Julian was weak, not dangerous. I was wrong about the second part tonight. Where is Micah right now? With Julian's father's housekeeper, Cormac insisted. Said it would look better if I needed to go anywhere unexpectedly, that the household should appear normal. Naomi's jaw tightened. He said that 10 minutes after Julian broke my ribs, Dad. Like he was managing a business problem. I stood up and walked to the counter and poured the water I had already boiled because my hands needed a task and there wasn't a better one available. I did not drink it. Tell me about the app, I said. The messages to Micah. What exactly did they say? I only saw one over his shoulder before he closed it. It said something about the old growing method on the east slope. The one my father-in-law tore out 15 years ago because it wasn't profitable enough. Whoever wrote it signed it Uncle E. She pulled her coat tighter, wincing at the movement. There's only one person in that family whose name starts with E. Dad. And he's supposed to be in the ground on the hill behind the tasting room. I thought about Elias Ashford for the first time in years. I remembered him at that funeral. Or rather, I remembered the empty space where a body should have been, and wasn't. Though at the time, nobody around me seemed troubled by that fact. I remembered Cormac's face at the reception, dry-eyed and businesslike, accepting condolences like a man confirming delivery of an invoice. How long has Julian known his brother might be alive? I asked. I don't think he does know. I think that's the point. Naomi shifted in the chair, careful of her side. Julian talks about Elias maybe twice a year, and both times it's the same 3 sentences. He was the smart one. He would have run this place better than any of us. Dad never got over it. That's the whole eulogy he gives over and over, like he's reciting something he memorized instead of something he remembers. That's strange, I said. A man doesn't usually memorize grief for his own brother. I used to think it was just how Julian grieves. Quietly, on a schedule. She looked at her hands. Now I think somebody taught him exactly what to say, and exactly how often to say it, and he's been saying it his whole adult life, without ever once questioning why the script never changes. I set the untouched tea down and looked at her directly. You said proof. The one piece of paper. What is it? I don't know yet. Naomi shook her head. I only know that whatever it is, it's the reason Julian's father has had 2 men watching our road for the past 4 days. I noticed the same truck 3 separate mornings. I didn't say anything to Julian because I didn't know if he'd tell his father I noticed. Someone was watching the road to her house. I filed that fact away next to the burn mark and the ribs and the dead man teaching an 8-year-old to draw. You're not going back there, I said. I have to go back for Micah. Not tonight. Not until I understand what we're dealing with. I picked up the prepaid phone from the table, the one she'd carried through the rain like it was the only thing worth saving. Whose number is on this? Mine, she said. It's how I've been talking to someone the past 2 weeks. Someone who told me if things got bad enough to run, I should call her first before anyone else. Who? Naomi looked at the door, then back at me, and something in her face made the room feel smaller than it had a moment before. Dorothy Vance, she said. She used to keep the books for Ashford Estate. 12 years. She called me out of nowhere 3 weeks ago and said there were things she needed to tell somebody before she ran out of time to say them. I had never heard the name in my life. I would spend the rest of that week wishing I still hadn't. This truck on your road, I said. Describe it. Dark green, older model, no plates I could read from the kitchen window. Same 2 men each time, never getting out, just parked at the end of the drive. For an hour, and then gone. Naomi's hand found the edge of the table. I thought I was being paranoid the first morning. By the 3rd, I stopped thinking that. Does Julian know you noticed them? No, and I need it to stay that way. Because if his father finds out I've been watching them watch me, I don't know what happens next. And I'm done finding out the hard way. The call came in before I dialed it, which meant somebody had been watching my phone number the same way Naomi had been watching that truck. It was 3:14 in the morning. Naomi had fallen asleep on the couch under a quilt, the first stillness I'd seen in her body in an hour. My phone lit up on the counter with a number I didn't recognize, and something in me already knew who it was before I answered. Mr. Okafor, a woman's voice said. Steady, older, rehearsed. My name is Dorothy Vance. I believe your daughter is with you tonight. She is, I said. You have 5 seconds to tell me how you know that before I hang up. I called her prepaid phone twice in the last hour. It went to voicemail both times, which means either she's hurt too badly to answer it, or she's finally somewhere safe enough that she doesn't need to. A pause. I'm hoping it's the second one. Who are you to her? Nobody 3 weeks ago. Now I suppose I'm the reason she had a phone to call you from at all. Dorothy's voice didn't waver, but there was something underneath it, worn smooth like a stone that had been turned over too many times. I kept the books for Ashford Estate for 12 years, Mr. Okafor. I retired 4 years ago with a good pension and a clean reputation, and I have spent every night since then knowing neither of those things was earned honestly. That's not an answer to my question. No, she agreed. It isn't. Here's the honest one. 9 years ago, Cormac Ashford asked me to process a life insurance claim and a set of estate documents for his eldest son. I did the paperwork. I filed it correctly, with the correct signatures, under the correct statutes, and I never once asked to see a death certificate from the county, because Cormac told me one was coming. And I believed him, the way you believe a man who signs your paychecks. I sat down at the kitchen table, across from where Naomi had been sitting 3 hours earlier. The chair was still warm. Elias Ashford, I said. You already know then. Something in her tone shifted. Relief, maybe, or the particular exhaustion of a person finally allowed to stop carrying something alone. Good. That saves us both a great deal of time. My daughter said there was never a body. There was never a body because there was never a death, Dorothy said. I didn't know that for certain until 8 months ago. I suspected it for years. A woman who does another man's books for over a decade learns to read what isn't written down as carefully as what is. What changed 8 months ago? A wire transfer. $12,000 routed through a shell account I recognized, because I'd set up 3 others just like it for Cormac over the years, always for the same purpose: making a problem disappear cleanly enough that nobody thinks to ask where it went. She exhaled, and I heard the sound of it catch slightly. The account it landed in belonged to a man named Raymond Coburn, a mechanic, according to public filings. Lives about 40 minutes from you, Mr. Okafor, fixing farm equipment nobody in this valley thinks twice about. And you believe Raymond Coburn is Elias Ashford? I believe Cormac Ashford has been quietly paying a dead man's living expenses for years, and I don't believe that's the kind of thing a father does out of guilt alone. I believe it's the kind of thing a man does to keep a threat contained. Dorothy's voice dropped lower. Your daughter's grandson has apparently found a way around that containment, Mr. Okafor. Through a drawing app of all the impossible things. Children have a way of finding the doors adults spend years bricking up. You said you retired 4 years ago. Why keep tracking his finances at all? Because I never stopped being afraid of him, she said. And for the first time, her composure slipped just enough to show me the shape of it. Cormac Ashford called me into his office the week before I left. He didn't threaten me directly. He never does that. He mentioned my grandson's college fund, the one he'd generously offered to help supplement 2 years earlier. He mentioned it the way you mention weather. I understood the message perfectly. I kept my mouth shut, and I kept a private copy of every ledger I ever touched. And I have not slept more than 5 hours a night since. Why call me tonight specifically? Why not the police 9 years ago, or 8 months ago, or last week? Because the police in this county answer to Sheriff Kessler. And Sheriff Kessler has taken a great deal of Ashford money for a great deal of years to make sure nobody official ever asks the questions you're about to ask. A pause, longer this time. Because I am 65 years old, and I have already spent enough of my life being useful to a man I should have questioned. I would like what's left of it to count for something else. I looked at my daughter sleeping under Ruth's old quilt, one arm still curled protectively over ribs that would take 6 weeks to heal. Where do I find this Raymond Coburn? I said. I can give you the address, Dorothy said. But Mr. Okafor, I need you to understand something before you drive out there. If that man is who I think he is, he has spent 9 years convincing an entire county he's dead. People don't do that because they're hiding from grief. They do that because they're hiding from someone who would kill them for staying alive. I have spent 40 years learning that the ground never lies to you all at once. It gives you the truth in layers, the way frost releases a field slowly instead of all at once at first light. Dorothy Vance gave me her truth the same way, and by the time she finished, I understood why she'd waited until 3 in the morning to say any of it out loud. The address, I said again. Dorothy, 14 Cutter's Mill Road, she said. It's a repair shop, small engines and farm equipment, tucked back off the highway past the old grain elevator. He's had it for 6 years under the Coburn name. I drove past it myself once, about a year ago. Told myself I was just curious about a man I'd been quietly sending information to. You've been in contact with him. Not directly. Never directly. I found a private mailbox registered to Raymond Coburn, and I sent one letter, unsigned, telling him what I suspected about the shell accounts and asking nothing in return. A pause, the kind that costs something to sit inside of. 3 weeks later, I got a card in the mail. No return address, No signature, just a single line. Thank you for the weather report. I understood what he meant. He was telling me he'd heard the storm was coming. I looked out the kitchen window at my own vineyard. Dark rows running down toward the creek, invisible now, except where the porch light caught the first few vines. I had planted those rows the year my wife Ruth died, because grief needed somewhere to go that wasn't inside my own chest. And dirt had always been willing to take whatever I handed it. You keep saying storm, I said. What exactly do you think is coming? I think Cormac Ashford has spent 12 years buying farmland in this valley through companies that don't carry his name. And I think at least 4 of those purchases involved families who were pressured, threatened, or ruined financially until selling looked like the only option left to them. Dorothy's voice had the particular precision of someone reciting numbers she'd memorized against her will. I think Elias found out. I think that's why he disappeared instead of inheriting. And I think whatever proof he's been sitting on for 9 years is the reason his father has never stopped watching for him. Quietly, patiently, the way you watch for a fire you started and never managed to put out. Why didn't you go to the authorities with the wire transfers? I said. $12,000 moving through shell accounts sounds like exactly the kind of thing a state investigator would want. Because a woman my age, alone, walking into a state office with photocopied ledgers and no corroboration, gets treated like a disgruntled former employee with a grudge. I needed someone the story would actually stick to. Dorothy's voice hardened slightly, the first real edge I'd heard in her. A father, a grandfather, someone whose daughter is lying in his kitchen right now with broken ribs, because that family thinks the rules don't reach them. That story gets believed, Mr. Okafor. Mine wouldn't have. I sat with the accusation folded inside her logic. Because she wasn't wrong. And because I didn't have the energy that night to be angry about being used as a more credible messenger. There's a woman named Renata Cruz, Dorothy said before I could respond. State Department of Agriculture Land Fraud Division. She's been circling Ashford Estate for almost 2 years on a completely separate matter, land acquisitions that don't hold up to scrutiny. I don't know her personally. I know her name from a subpoena request that crossed my desk 18 months ago. One Cormac's lawyers managed to quash before it went anywhere. You're telling me the state already suspects something. I'm telling you the state has been circling this family for 2 years and hasn't landed a single blow, because every time they get close, something disappears. Witnesses stop returning calls. Records get misfiled. I imagine you can guess by now who benefits every time that happens. Dorothy exhaled slowly. Talk to Cruz before you do anything else, Mr. Okafor. Not the sheriff, not a lawyer. Her. If what you find at that repair shop is what I think it is, you're going to need someone with actual authority standing behind you before Cormac Ashford understands what's coming. And if I go to the shop first, then you go in blind, and you risk spooking a man who spent 9 years perfecting the art of disappearing. Her voice softened just slightly. He didn't survive this long by being careless, Mr. Okafor. Whatever he's carrying, whatever proof made your grandson's father-in-law nervous enough to have your daughter's road watched, that man will not hand it to a stranger who shows up unannounced at dawn. I looked at Naomi, still asleep on the couch, and at the burn mark on her wrist I could see even from across the room, raised and red and deliberate. Give me Cruz's information, I said. I'll call in the morning. You'll call in 3 hours, Dorothy said. It's already morning, Mr. Okafor. It has been for a while now. Most people just haven't noticed the light changing yet. She gave me a phone number and a badge division. I wrote on the back of an envelope, with a hand that had finally mercifully stopped shaking. Before she hung up, she said one more thing, quiet enough that I had to press the phone harder against my ear to catch it. I need you to know something else, she said. I am not telling you this because I expect forgiveness for the 12 years I spent not asking questions I should have asked. I am telling you because I finally understand there's only one way to start paying down what I owe, and it isn't silence. It was never going to be silence. The line went dead. I sat at my kitchen table with an envelope in one hand and my sleeping daughter 20 feet away. And I understood the way you understand weather before it arrives, that the quiet life I had built for myself since Ruth passed was over, and it was not coming back. Renata Cruz chose a diner on the edge of town instead of an office, and it took me the better part of an hour to understand why. Government buildings have cameras in the parking lot and sign-in sheets at the front desk. And a woman who had spent 20 months trying to build a case nobody could see coming had learned to avoid both. She was already in a corner booth when I arrived, a leather notebook open in front of her instead of a laptop, a badge wallet closed on the table. Like she wanted it visible, but not flaunted. Mid-40s, dark hair pulled back. The particular stillness of someone who had trained herself out of fidgeting a long time ago. "Mr. Okafor," she said, not looking up right away. "Sit facing the door. Old habit. You'll understand why in a minute." I sat. The waitress came and went with coffee neither of us touched. "Dorothy called you," Cruz said. It wasn't a question. "Dorothy called me at 3 a.m. and told me my daughter's family has been quietly destroying other families for over a decade," I said. "I'd like to know if that's true before I decide what to do with the information." "It's true." Cruz closed her notebook, folded her hands over it. "I've been investigating Ashford Estates land acquisitions for 20 months. 4 properties in this valley changed hands under circumstances that don't hold up once you look closely. Families who suddenly couldn't get financing renewed. Water rights disputes that appeared out of nowhere and vanished the moment the land sold. A barn fire that insurance investigators called accidental despite 3 separate red flags in the report. And you can't prove any of it. I can't prove enough of it. Every time I get within reach of something solid, a witness stops returning calls, or a document that should exist doesn't, or a filing deadline gets missed in a way that benefits exactly one family in this county." She met my eyes directly. "Sheriff Kessler has taken money from Cormac Ashford for at least 6 years. I can't prove that in a courtroom yet either, but I know it the way you know rain is coming before the first drop lands." How does a state investigator end up this far outside official channels? Because official channels in this county lead back to Cormac more often than they lead anywhere useful. Cruz's jaw tightened slightly, the first crack I'd seen in her composure. 18 months ago, I requested expanded resources through my regional office. The request sat unanswered for 4 months and then quietly died. I later learned Cormac has a contact in the state capital who made 2 calls. I don't operate through normal channels anymore because normal channels have already been compromised once. The authorization I work under now comes from a judge in a different county entirely, someone with no connection to this valley. Dorothy told me the same thing about Kessler. Dorothy is not wrong about very much in my experience. Cruz opened the notebook again, turned it to face me. A handwritten timeline, dates and initials, nothing that would mean anything to a stranger. "What I need, Mr. Okafor, is something that connects Cormac directly to the money. Not pattern evidence, not precedent. The financial spine, the actual transactions. Dorothy has ledgers. Dorothy's ledgers give me 12 years of smoke. I need fire." Cruz tapped the page once. "There's something else you need to know before you decide how deep you're willing to go into this. It concerns your grandson." Something in my chest went cold and stayed there. 6 months ago, Cruz said, Cormac Ashford insisted Micah begin spending 3 nights a week at the main estate house, officially for what he called family bonding time. I have reason to believe that arrangement was never about affection. Explain that. Under Washington family law, if your daughter ever attempted to leave the marriage and relocate with her son, The fact that Micah has an established secondary residence at his grandfather's estate gives Cormac's attorneys grounds to petition for a custody evaluation before any relocation could proceed. It would tie her up in family court for months, possibly years. And it would happen on Cormac's terms, with Cormac's lawyers in a county where Cormac has spent a decade cultivating exactly the kind of relationships that make judges rule his way. Cruz watched my face while she said it. He wasn't being generous, Mr. Okafor. He was building a cage and calling it a bedroom. I sat with that for a long moment, and something moved through my chest that was colder and cleaner than anger. Something closer to the particular clarity that arrives right before you stop hesitating. My daughter couldn't leave without risking losing her son, I said. Cormac made sure of that long before she understood she needed to run.
Cruz said quietly.
Which is why what happens next can't come from my office first. If the state moves visibly before we have the financial evidence locked down, his attorneys will see the shape of it and start filing motions before I get within a mile of anything useful. I need the first move to come from outside, from me. From someone he doesn't expect, someone who isn't already on his radar as a threat. Cruz slid a card across the table, nothing on it but a phone number. Go to the repair shop, Mr. Okafor. Talk to the man Dorothy thinks is alive, but do it carefully and call me the moment you have anything, because we are both running out of time to be careful. I put the card in my jacket pocket, next to the envelope, with Cutter's Mill Road written on it in Dorothy's careful hand. Cruz dropped a few bills on the table for coffee neither of us had touched, and paused before she walked away. One more thing, she said. Whatever you find out there today, don't tell your daughter until you're certain. She's already carrying more than one person should have to carry alone. The cruiser was parked at the turnout 3 miles from my property, engine running, and it pulled out behind me the moment I passed. Holding one car length back with the kind of patience that told me this had been planned rather than noticed. I signaled properly at every turn. I kept my speed under the limit. The cruiser stayed with me anyway, close enough to mean something, far enough to deny meaning anything at all if anyone ever asked. At the crossroads by the old grain co-op, the lights came on for one short pulse. The signal that says, "Pull over," without saying it in words a lawyer could quote back later. I pulled over. Sheriff Wade Kessler took his time walking up to my window, and he positioned himself so the afternoon sun fell directly behind him, forcing me to squint up into a silhouette instead of a face. I understood the trick immediately. I had watched enough men use height and light and angle to manufacture authority they hadn't otherwise earned. "Desmond Okafor," he said, warm as a man greeting an old neighbor at the feed store. "Fine afternoon for a drive, Sheriff. Heard your daughter's been staying out at your place." He rested one forearm on my roof, leaning in slightly, close enough that I could smell coffee and something sweeter underneath it. Mint, maybe. The kind men chew to cover other habits. Family visits. Important this time of year. "She's welcome any time," I said, giving him nothing. "I imagine so." Kessler's eyes, pale and set a little too close together, moved over my face with an assessment considerably less friendly than his voice. "You know, Desmond, I've worn this badge in this county for 11 years. In 11 years, I've learned exactly one thing worth knowing above everything else." He paused, the way men pause when they want you to understand the pause is doing work. "This is a community that handles its own business. Good people, families who've been here generations, they understand some matters don't need outside help to get sorted properly. Is that right?" "It is." He straightened slightly, glancing down the empty road behind us, before continuing the movement of a man checking whether an audience existed before deciding how much further to push. "I've known the Ashford family a long time. Cormac's done a great deal for this county. Scholarships, the new fire station roof, half the youth programs at the community center. Man like that? He doesn't deserve to have his family's private business turned into gossip because somebody got emotional and started making phone calls to people who have no business being called.
I haven't made any calls concerning the Ashford sheriff.
Of course you haven't. His smile didn't reach his eyes, hadn't at any point in the conversation. Just making conversation, Desmond. That's all this is. He tapped the roof of my truck twice with one knuckle, the particular gesture of a man closing a conversation he considers finished.
You've got a grandson, don't you?
Micah. Sharp kid from what I hear. Kids that age need stability, routine, a settled home. People who don't go stirring up trouble that doesn't concern them. I sat very still and let him say the rest of it. Because I had already learned in one afternoon with Renata Cruz that the most dangerous thing Cormac Ashford's people did was never the thing they said directly.
You have a nice day, Desmond,
Kessler said, straightening up. And give my regards to your daughter. Hope she's recovering well from whatever's been going around. He walked back to his cruiser without hurrying, pulled out, and drove away in the opposite direction without once looking in his mirror. I sat at that intersection for a long moment, hands still on the wheel, and felt something settle in my chest that was colder and more certain than the fear I probably should have felt instead. He knew. Not everything, not yet, but enough to know a message needed sending, and he had sent it, wrapped in weather talk and a compliment about my grandson, which told me exactly how comfortable this county had gotten with threats that never had to sound like threats at all. 11 years of men like Kessler learning that the softest words carried the sharpest edges, provided you delivered them with a smile and never once raised your voice. I called Cruz from the parking lot of the co-op, hands steadier than I expected them to be. Kessler just stopped me, I said. Said nothing directly. Mentioned Micah by name. Mentioned stability. There was a pause on the line, brief. And when Cruz spoke again, her voice had lost some of its careful neutrality. That's faster than I expected, she said. It means someone already told him you and I spoke, which means the leak isn't in my office, Mr. Okafor. It's somewhere closer to you. There's no one closer to me who knows, I said. You, Dorothy, and my daughter who was asleep the entire time I spoke to either of you. Then think carefully about who else might have seen your truck on this road today, Cruz said. Because Kessler doesn't stop people at random, and he definitely doesn't mention an 8-year-old's name by accident. I thought back through the day, the diner, the drive out, the drive back, and landed on the one detail I hadn't given weight to until now. A dark green truck parked at the edge of the co-op lot when I first pulled in to meet Cruz. Gone by the time we finished. I hadn't thought anything of it at the time. Trucks like that were common enough in farm country to be invisible. There was a vehicle at the diner, I said slowly. I didn't get a plate. I didn't think I needed to. Describe it. Dark green. Older model. Same description my daughter gave me for the truck that's been watching her road. Cruz was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had gone flat and careful, in a way that told me she was choosing every word with precision. Mr. Okafor, I need you to understand what that means. If the same vehicle was outside your daughter's house and outside the diner where you met me, someone isn't just watching Naomi anymore. They're watching you too. And they've been watching you since before you ever called me this morning. The Cadillac came up my driveway an hour before sunset, and I recognized the man who stepped out of it before I ever saw his face. Because there are people whose posture announces them from 40 feet away. Cormac Ashford walked toward my porch, carrying a bottle of wine with his own label on it. Overcoat open, despite the cold. Moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once in his life arrived somewhere and felt unwelcome. I set down the pruning shears I'd been cleaning and met him before he reached the steps. Desmond.
He said my name like he'd been looking forward to using it. Silver-haired, broad-shouldered, a tan that came from somewhere expensive rather than from actual work in actual soil. I hope I'm not intruding. I was in the area and I thought, well, families ought to check on each other, especially during a difficult stretch. I did not take the bottle. He held it a moment longer, then set it on the porch rail with the easy grace of a man accustomed to offers being redirected rather than refused. Douglas? I started. Cormac, he corrected, smiling as though I'd made an honest mistake instead of testing him. I appreciate you stopping by, I said. But I think we both know this isn't a social visit. I imagine you're worried about Naomi. His voice carried the particular warmth of a man reciting concern rather than feeling it. That's completely natural. She's been going through a difficult period emotionally. Julian and I have both been very concerned. I want you to know we're handling it as a family. She has access to every resource she could possibly need. She has 3 broken ribs, Cormac. Something flickered behind his pale eyes. There and gone so fast, I might have imagined it, if I hadn't spent 40 years watching for exactly that kind of tell, in soil that looked fine on the surface and wasn't. Accidents happen in every household, he said smoothly. I think we're both men who understand how the world actually works. Some situations are better handled with discretion rather than outside involvement. Private resolutions are so much less painful for everyone, especially for children. My daughter isn't a private resolution. She's a person. Cormac tilted his head slightly, the gesture of a man absorbing a mild inconvenience rather than an accusation. Of course she is. And I want what's best for her, Desmond, the same as you do. That's precisely why I'm here, instead of letting lawyers speak for both of us. Lawyers complicate what families should be able to resolve quietly. You mentioned resources. What resources exactly does a woman with broken ribs need from the family of the man who broke them? His jaw tightened by a fraction so small, most people would have missed it entirely. I had spent my whole life reading small changes in things that didn't want to be read. Julian made a mistake, Cormac said, his voice dropping into something almost gentle. A serious one. I won't pretend otherwise to you. But mistakes, even serious ones, don't have to end a family. Naomi has a good life with us, a beautiful home, a son who wants his parents together. These things matter more than a single bad night, Desmond, whatever it might feel like from where you're standing. It wasn't a single bad night. It was 2 years of them. That landed somewhere. I watched it land. Watched the practiced warmth cost him a fraction more effort to maintain. I think we're both men who understand how the world actually works, he said again, quieter this time. Some things are better handled with discretion rather than outside involvement. I've heard you've been asking questions around town, talking to people. I'd hate for that kind of energy to be misdirected, especially when there are more constructive ways to spend it. His pale eyes held mine for exactly 2 seconds before he continued. Micah is such a wonderful boy. It would be a shame for him to be caught up in any confusion that doesn't need to involve him. The cold that moved through my chest at the sound of my grandson's name was not fear. I want to be precise about that. It was something harder, something that had been building since Kessler tapped my truck roof with one knuckle and told me the exact same thing, wrapped in different words. 2 men, 1 badge, and 1 bottle of wine between them, delivering the same warning inside 12 hours. And neither one of them foolish enough to say the word threat out loud. I'll tell Naomi you stopped by, I said, and stepped back toward the door. Cormac stood on my porch for 3 full seconds, holding my gaze, running whatever calculation men like him run behind eyes that pale. You take care of yourself, Desmond, he said pleasantly, and picked the wine bottle back up off the rail before walking to his car, without hurrying, without looking back. The unhurried ease of a man accustomed to conversations ending on his terms, even when they don't. I watched the Cadillac back down my drive
and disappear around the bend before I let my hands unclench. 2 visits in one day, a sheriff and a patriarch each of them, delivering the same message through a different mouth, and both of them careful enough never to say a single word I could repeat to Cruz as a direct threat. That was the part that frightened me most, standing alone on my own porch as the light dropped toward the tree line. Men like Cormac Ashford didn't need to threaten anyone directly. They only needed you to understand what they were capable of, and then let your own imagination finish the sentence for them. What I didn't see happen on my own porch, I learned about 20 minutes later, and it was worse for arriving secondhand, because I had to sit with the picture Naomi painted instead of witnessing it myself, and having something to do with my hands while it happened. Micah had been in the side yard the whole time Cormac stood at my door. Naomi had kept in there deliberately, out of earshot, occupied with a coloring book and a juice box, certain her father-in-law's visit would stay contained to the porch, the way these visits usually did. She hadn't accounted for Cormac deciding on his way back to the Cadillac to swing past the yard and say goodbye to his grandson. Naomi found me in the kitchen, still standing at the window, watching the space where the Cadillac had been. Her face told me something had happened before her voice managed to catch up to it. "Dad," she said, "something just happened out there. With Micah." "He crouched down next to Micah," Naomi said, still pale from telling it. "Asked what he was drawing. Micah does this thing when he's proud of something. He just starts talking before anyone can stop him." "What did he say?" "He held up the picture and said, 'Chu-Ray taught me to draw the roots first, so the vines don't fall down later.'" Naomi's hands were shaking again, the same fine tremor I'd watched settle and resurface all day. "Cormac went completely still, Dad. Just for a second. I was 20 feet away and I saw it happen. This pause that didn't belong in the conversation at all." "What did he say back?" He smiled. Asked who Ray was, casual as anything, like he was asking about a friend from school. She pressed her good hand against her forehead. Micah caught himself. I could see it happen on his face, that half-second where he remembered he wasn't supposed to say the name out loud. And he just shrugged and said he didn't remember, that it was from a video probably. Cormac let it go. Ruffled his hair, said something about growing boys and their imaginations, and walked back to his car. How long did that pause last? The one before he smiled. Naomi thought about it, her eyes going somewhere distant, replaying it, the way people replay the seconds right before an accident, trying to locate the exact moment things could have gone differently. Not long. A second, maybe 2. She shook her head slowly. "But I know his face by now, Dad. 5 years of watching him hide things behind that same expression. That wasn't confusion. That was a man doing arithmetic he didn't want anyone to see him doing." I sat with that for a long moment. A man who had spent 9 years constructing an elaborate architecture of grief around a son he'd never actually lost did not simply let go of a name that shouldn't exist. Men like Cormac Ashford filed things away. They waited, and they watched, and they made decisions on their own schedule, never on anyone else's. "He knows something's wrong now," I said, "even if he doesn't know what yet." "I don't think he needed Micah to tell him anything he didn't already suspect," Naomi said quietly. "I think Micah just confirmed a fear Cormac's been carrying for longer than any of us realized. You don't build an entire family around a lie for 9 years without lying awake sometimes wondering if the lie is still holding." "Does Julian know his brother might be alive?" "I don't think so. I think if he knew, I would have seen it somewhere. A slip, a look, something." Naomi wrapped both arms carefully around herself, favoring her ribs. "Julian talks about Elias like he's reciting a eulogy someone else wrote for him. I used to think that was grief. Now I think it's a script he was handed a long time ago and never once questioned." I thought about Kessler's visit that morning and Cormac's visit that afternoon. Both of them delivered within hours of each other. Both of them mentioning my grandson's name like a bargaining chip, disguised as affection. If Cormac had walked away from my porch already suspicious, and then walked directly into evidence that his dead son's name was alive in his own grandson's mouth, the calculation happening behind those pale eyes right now was not a calculation I wanted to be on the wrong side of. "We need to talk to Micah," I said. "Tonight. Before his father takes him back to that house for the weekend." "He's asleep already. It's almost 9. Then we wake him gently, or we wait until morning. But we don't let another day pass without knowing exactly what he knows, and how much of it Cormac might already suspect he knows." I looked at my daughter, still fragile, still healing, and felt the particular weight of asking more of her than I had any right to ask. "I'm sorry, Naomi. I know you wanted one night without this." "There isn't going to be a night without this," she said, quiet and steady, in a way that reminded me suddenly and sharply of her mother. "Not until it's actually over." Naomi nodded, already moving toward the stairs, and I followed her up into the quiet of my own home, aware for the first time that whatever protection I thought I'd been offering my family under this roof might already be running out of time. Micah was awake when I knocked softly on the guest room door, sitting up in bed with his tablet, dark in his lap, like he'd been waiting for someone to come asking the question he already knew was coming. "Grandpa," he said before I'd even fully stepped inside, "am I in trouble?" "No, baby." I sat on the edge of the bed, careful of the small space between us, the particular distance an 8-year-old needs to feel safe enough to talk, instead of just enough to feel cornered. "I just want to see your drawing, the one you showed your grandfather Cormac today." Micah's face did something complicated, caught between pride and worry, the expression of a child who has been told 2 different rules by 2 different adults and hasn't figured out yet which one wins. "It's just vineyard rows," he said carefully. "Like the ones you have. Can I see it?" He hesitated, then reached for the tablet and opened a folder full of drawings. Dozens of them, more than I expected from a boy his age. Careful rows of vines, roots drawn in dark brown beneath the soil line. Small notes in a child's uneven printing along the margins. Root depth matters most in year 1. Don't rush the canopy. "Micah, this is very good work," I said honestly, because it was. "Who taught you to draw the roots first?" "Chu-Ray," he said, and then his whole body seemed to fold inward slightly. The posture of someone realizing a mistake right as they're making it. "I'm not supposed to say that." "Who told you not to say it?" "Mom." He picked at the edge of his blanket. "She said it's our secret. That Chu-Ray is helping me learn, but nobody else needs to know, because grown-up things are complicated sometimes, and it's easier if it's just between us." I kept my voice as level and unhurried as I could manage, because I understood sitting there that I was talking to the only living person besides Naomi who had direct contact with a man the rest of the county believed was 9 years dead. "How long have you been talking to him?" "A few weeks, maybe a month." Micah's eyes flicked up to mine, searching for permission to keep going. "He messages me through the drawing app. He's really good at vineyards. He knows everything about roots and soil and when to prune. Better than the guy who takes care of Grandpa Cormac's vines." "Does he ever tell you his last name? Or where he lives?" "No, just Chu-Ray." Micah frowned, working through a memory. "He asked me once if I liked visiting your vineyard better than Grandpa Cormac's. I said yes, because yours smells better, and you let me eat grapes right off the vine. He said that was a good sign." "A good sign of what?" "I don't know. He didn't explain. He does that sometimes, says something and then changes the subject really fast, like he caught himself saying too much." Micah scrolled to another drawing, this one showing 2 vineyards side by side, one lush and green, the other gray and half-drawn, unfinished on purpose it seemed. He asked me to draw what I thought his old home looked like. I didn't know what to draw because he never told me where it was. So I made this one up. I looked at the gray, unfinished vineyard on the screen and felt something tighten in my chest that had nothing to do with fear. Has he ever asked about your mother or about anyone in your family? Micah nodded slowly. He asked if Mom was okay a few times. Not in a creepy way, more like he was worried. He asked if Dad was nice to her. The boy's voice dropped uncertain now, testing whether this next part was safe to say out loud. I told him, sometimes Dad gets scary when Grandpa Cormac is around. Chu-Rei didn't say anything back for a long time after that. Like a whole day. A good sign of what I wanted to ask again and didn't, because pressing too hard on an 8-year-old felt like exactly the wrong instrument for the job in front of me. Micah, I need you to do something for me, I said instead. Next time Chu-Rei messages you, I need you to tell me. Not your grandfather Cormac, not Julian, me or your mom. Can you do that? Is he a bad guy? Micah's voice had gone small, the particular smallness children reach for when they sense the ground shifting under a conversation they don't have the full map of yet. I don't think so, I said, and meant it, though I couldn't have told you exactly why I believed it as certainly as I did. I think he might be someone who's been hiding for a very long time, and I think he might need our help as much as we might need his. Micah considered that, with the peculiar seriousness only children bring to matters they've decided are important enough to take seriously. He asked me something weird last time, Micah said slowly. He asked if Grandpa Cormac still keeps his boat at the same marina. I said I didn't know. He said never mind that it wasn't important, but Grandpa, he sounded like it was important. His voice got quiet when he asked it, like when you're trying not to let someone hear how much you want to know something. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with Dorothy's envelope open in front of me, the address at Cutter's Mill Road, and I laid every piece we had collected across the surface, like a man reading soil samples from 4 different fields, trying to see if they belonged to the same ground. Elias Ashford disappeared 9 years ago, after refusing to help his father acquire more farmland. A truck found empty at the bottom of a ravine, no body recovered. A closed casket funeral 6 months later, that Cormac insisted upon, despite the county coroner's own hesitation about signing off without remains. A wire transfer 8 months ago into an account belonging to a mechanic named Raymond Coburn. A man teaching an 8-year-old to draw vineyard roots the correct way, using techniques passed down through actual experience rather than anything you'd find on the internet. A man who asked quiet and careful whether Cormac still kept his boat at the same marina, the way you ask about something you used to know intimately and haven't dared check on directly in years. And a man who went still for exactly 1 second when his own grandson said the name Ray out loud. I thought about the marina question longest of all, because it was the detail that didn't fit the shape of curiosity. A stranger doesn't ask about a boat slip. A stranger doesn't need to know if the water access is still the same. Only someone who had once known that marina the way he knew his own hands would think to ask whether it had changed the specific homesickness of a person checking whether a door he used to walk through freely was still standing where he'd left it. I thought about the closed casket, too. Something that had nagged at me since Naomi first said the words 9 years ago in my kitchen. A man with Cormac Ashford's resources, Cormac Ashford's connections, Cormac Ashford's need to control every visible detail of his own family's story, does not accept an empty casket. Funeral because a body couldn't be recovered from a shallow mountain ravine. Rivers give bodies back, eventually, especially in a county where every landowner within 20 miles would have organized a search if asked. Nobody organized a search because Cormac never asked for one. A man doesn't skip searching for his own son's body unless some part of him already knows there's no body to find. because the son in question walked away from that ravine on his own two legs.
I pulled out a legal pad and wrote the two names side by side.
Elias Ashford, Raymond Coburn. I drew a line connecting them, then crossed it out, then drew it again, because crossing it out felt like a lie I wasn't willing to keep telling myself at 4 a.m. Everything fit. The timing of the disappearance matched the timing of Cormac's land acquisitions, accelerating rather than slowing, as though whatever conscience had been slowing Cormac down disappeared right alongside his eldest son. The vineyard knowledge matched a man raised on that exact soil, rather than one who'd learned it from books or a hired consultant. The careful, deliberate distance from Julian, from Cormac, from the entire family, matched a man who understood better than anyone alive exactly how dangerous his own father could be when a threat needed managing, because he'd likely watched that management happen to other people first, long before it ever happened to him. I thought about what Dorothy had said on the phone, the words I hadn't been able to shake since. People don't fake their own death because they're hiding from grief. They do it because they're hiding from someone who would kill them for staying alive. I looked at the two names on the legal pad until the letters blurred slightly from exhaustion. And I understood the way you understand a fact your whole body has already accepted before your mind finishes catching up. That I was no longer investigating a rumor. Elias Ashford was alive 40 minutes from my kitchen table, fixing farm equipment under a stranger's name. And he had spent 9 years watching his family from a distance, close enough to still worry about his nephew, still ask about a boat slip, still care whether the woman his brother married was safe. A man who had built an entire second life out of silence and had somehow, impossibly, never quite managed to let go of the first one. I thought about what it must cost a person to do that. To watch a nephew grow up through a drawing app instead of a Sunday dinner table. To ask about a boat slip instead of simply driving to it. 9 years of choosing distance over danger and choosing it again every single day since one silent decision stacked on top of another until silence itself became the only shape his love was allowed to take. Outside my window, the first gray light was starting to separate the vineyard rows from the dark behind them. I did not move. I set the legal pad down flat on the table and pressed both palms against the wood and listened. A branch settling somewhere out past row 9. The refrigerator cycling on, then off. Water moving somewhere in the pipes, behind the wall the house doing its small, unconscious work, while the rest of it held still. Somewhere upstairs, the particular creak of Naomi shifting in her sleep, one board answering her weight the way it had answered mine for 30 years. I sat with my hands flat on the table and let the gray light come up slow across the rows, and for a while I did not think about Elias Ashford at all, or Cormac, or anything with a name attached to it. I only listened to the house breathing around me and let it be enough for exactly as long as it needed to be. 14 Cutter's Mill Road turned out to be a low steel building set back from the highway, behind a gravel lot full of tractors in various stages of disassembly. The kind of place that existed in the gap between what a business needed to look like and what it actually needed to be. I parked beside a faded green pickup and sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel, trying to decide what a man says to a person he has never met, who might in fact be someone he has known his entire adult life, through the shape of a family he watched his daughter marry into. There wasn't a good version of that sentence. I got out anyway. A bell over the door announced me before I could announce myself. The shop smelled like grease and cut metal orderly, despite the chaos of parts stacked along every wall, the particular organization of a man who knew exactly where everything was, even if no one else could have found it. A figure straightened up from behind an engine block on the far bench, wiping his hands on a rag, and looked at me across the length of the shop, with an expression that told me everything Dorothy's theory hadn't quite proven until that exact second. He had Julian's jaw. Julian's exact jaw, the one I'd watched clench and unclench 100 times at family dinners, set now on a face 9 years older and considerably more weathered than any photograph I'd ever seen of the Ashford family. "Help you with something?" he said. Careful, neutral. A voice that had learned to give away nothing to strangers who wandered in off a rural highway. "I'm looking for Raymond Coburn. You found him." He set the rag down slowly. "And you are Desmond Okafor." I watched his face for the reaction, and I got one small but unmistakable. The particular stillness of a man recognizing a name he'd been half expecting and half dreading in equal measure. "My daughter is married to Julian Ashford." The silence that followed lasted long enough that I heard a compressor cycle on somewhere in the back of the shop, mechanical and indifferent to the two men standing frozen on either side of it. "You should go," he said, finally, quiet, not unkind. "Whatever you think you know, whatever brought you out here, you should turn around and go home and forget you ever found this address." "My daughter has 3 broken ribs, Elias." I watched the name land on him like a physical weight. Watched something in his shoulders drop half an inch. The particular collapse of a man who has spent 9 years bracing for a sentence, and finally hears it spoken out loud by someone else's mouth instead of his own. "Don't call me that," he said, but there was no force behind it anymore. "That man's been dead a long time. He's been dead exactly as long as it took your father to decide he was more useful buried than standing in the way of buying out 3 more farms on the valley floor." I kept my voice level, watching him carefully. "Your nephew has been talking to you for a month through a drawing app, teaching himself to draw roots the way you taught him. And 2 days ago, he mentioned your name in front of your father by accident. Cormac knows something's wrong now, Elias. He might not know exactly what yet, but he's not a patient man. And he's already had a sheriff and himself both warn me to stay away from asking questions." Something crossed his face I couldn't name at the time, though I would understand it better later. Not surprise exactly, more the specific exhaustion of a man who has run every version of this scenario through his head 1,000 times, and is still not prepared for the one that's actually happening. "I told myself the drawings were harmless," he said, mostly to himself. "I told myself an 8-year-old couldn't possibly connect any of it back to anything real. I was careful. I thought I was careful. You were careful enough for 9 years. One slip doesn't undo that. One slip is all it ever takes with my father." His jaw tightened. Julian's exact gesture, again inherited or learned, I couldn't tell which. "You don't understand what he's capable of when he feels something slipping out of his control. I understand it better than anyone alive, which is precisely why I've spent 9 years teaching a child to draw instead of walking back through my own front door." Elias Ashford, or Raymond Coburn, or whoever he had decided he needed to become to survive his own family, stood very still behind that workbench, and something moved across his face that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite relief, but sat somewhere uncomfortably between the two. "How bad are her ribs?" he said quietly. "Naomi's. 3, maybe 4. She'll heal. And Micah, is he safe?" "For now. I don't know how long that lasts." I stepped further into the shop, close enough now to see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent 9 years sleeping lightly. "I need you to tell me what you know, Elias. All of it. Because whatever proof you've been sitting on for 9 years, it's the only thing standing between my family and a man who has already decided broken ribs are an acceptable cost of doing business." He looked at me for a long moment, some calculation running behind eyes that were nothing like his father's. Nothing pale or practiced about them at all. Just tired and careful. And finally, after 9 years out of places left to hide, "Lock the door," he said, "and turn the sign around. This is going to take a while, and I'd rather my father's people didn't see your truck parked here longer than they'd expect a repair to take." Elias pulled 2 folding chairs from behind a parts shelf and set them facing each other in the small, clear space near the wood stove, the closest thing that shop had to a place built for conversation instead of repair work. "6 months before the ravine," he said, "I found out my father had been financing something worse than land deals. 3 families in this valley lost their farms that year alone, and I'd been the one signing off on the loan restructuring paperwork without asking hard enough questions about why the terms kept shifting after the ink dried. You worked for him. I was going to inherit everything. Working for him wasn't optional, not in any way that felt like a choice at the time." Elias stared at the wood stove like it held something worth reading. "I found a pattern. Farms that refused to sell got hit with water rights disputes that appeared out of nowhere. Financing that had been reliable for decades suddenly wasn't renewed. A barn fire on the Delacroix property that insurance called accidental, despite 3 things about it that weren't. I brought it to my father directly. I actually believed, God help me, that he didn't know. He knew. He'd been running it for years." Elias's jaw worked once hard. He didn't deny it. He didn't even seem surprised I'd figured it out. He just explained it to me, the way you'd explain a business strategy to someone you expected to eventually appreciate the elegance of it. Land accumulates faster when the sellers are desperate. Desperate sellers accept lower offers. My father had turned desperation into a supply chain. "What did you do?" I told him I wouldn't be part of it. I told him I was going to the county, maybe the state, and I didn't care what it cost the family name. Elias's hands resting on his knees curled slowly into fists and then released. He didn't argue with me. That was the part that should have frightened me most looking back. He just nodded, said he understood, and told me to think it over for a week before doing anything I couldn't undo. And during that week, my truck went into a ravine off Mill Creek Road, and I was very nearly in it when it happened. Elias's voice had gone flat, the particular flatness of someone reciting a memory they'd worn smooth from replaying it too many times alone. I'd stopped at the old grain elevator to meet a contact, purely by accident, 10 minutes before the truck was supposed to leave. Whoever cut the brake line assumed I'd be driving down Mill Creek at the usual time. I wasn't. A ranch hand borrowing my truck for the afternoon was. The compressor cycled off somewhere behind us, and the shop went very quiet. Quiet enough that I could hear my own pulse in my ears. "He died," I said. It wasn't a question. He died in a truck meant for me, on a road my father knew I traveled every single day at exactly that hour. Elias's eyes, when they finally met mine, held 9 years of something I recognized, because I'd been carrying a smaller version of it myself since Ruth passed. I understood immediately what had actually happened, and I understood I had exactly 1 chance to make sure it never happened to me for real. I drove to the ravine myself that night, pushed the wreck the rest of the way down with a second truck, and let everyone assume I'd been in it. My father built the funeral. I let him. That ranch hand had a name. Dale Whitcomb. Elias said it quickly, like a wound he touched often enough to keep it from closing wrong. 23 years old, 2 younger sisters he was putting through community college on ranch wages. I've sent money to his mother every month for 9 years through an account she thinks belongs to a charitable trust for agricultural workers. It doesn't undo anything, I know that. But I couldn't let it be nothing either. Does she know who you actually are? No, and she never will if I have anything to say about it. His voice hardened slightly. That's the one thing I've managed to keep clean in all of this. Everything else I've made a mess of one way or another. Why not go to the police? Tell them what you'd found, what he'd done. Because the police in this county have belonged to my father longer than I've been alive, Mr. Okafor. And because a dead man can't be silenced twice. He looked down at his hands. I told myself I'd come back eventually, gather more proof from a distance, find someone who couldn't be bought, someone who'd actually listen. 9 years is a very long eventually. What proof? Financial records, correspondence. Enough to show the pattern wasn't coincidence, if I could ever get it in front of someone who'd actually act on it, instead of burying it the way everything gets buried in this county. He rubbed a hand across his face, exhaustion settling into every line of it. I kept waiting for the right moment, the right person. I told myself I was being strategic. Some mornings, I think I was just being a coward with excellent reasons. Neither of us spoke for a while after that. I listened to the wood stove tick as it cooled, to a truck passing on the highway outside, to the particular silence of two men sitting with a story too large to respond to right away. I did not fill that silence. There are moments a person needs simply to sit, inside their own history, without being asked to explain it further. And I recognize this as one of them. The way you recognize a field that needs to lie fallow before it can hold anything new. Elias stared at the cold stove. Somewhere outside, a crow called twice and went quiet. The shop smelled like oil and cut steel, and 9 years of a man learning to live inside a name that wasn't his. There's something you need to understand about my brother, Elias said, finally breaking the silence that had settled between us like dust after a long fall. Before you decide what kind of man you're dealing with, I know what kind of man broke my daughter's ribs. You know what he did. You don't know why he did it. And the why matters more than you'd think, even if it doesn't undo a single bruise. Elias leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Julian was 12 when I turned 18 and started working directly under our father. I watched what happened to him over the next 6 years, and I've spent 9 more years since, wishing I'd understood it sooner. Explain it to me. Our father doesn't raise children. He constructs them. Elias's voice had gone careful, precise. The tone of a man choosing words he'd clearly turned over many times, alone. Every time Julian showed independence, my father found a way to make dependence look safer. Every time Julian pushed back on something, my father found a way to make pushing back cost more than it was worth. By the time Julian was 20, he'd learned the fastest way to survive our household was to become whatever my father needed him to become in any given moment. Give me an example. Elias exhaled slowly, like the memory cost him something to retrieve. Julian wanted to study agricultural science instead of business. 15 years old, obsessed with soil chemistry, used to fill notebooks with it. Our father let him apply, let him get accepted, let him get excited enough to believe it was actually going to happen. Then, 3 weeks before he was supposed to leave, our father sat him down and explained very calmly that the business needed him instead. That soil chemistry was a hobby and not a life, and that continuing to insist otherwise would be considered a rejection of everything the family had built for him. He looked at the workbench like it held the memory instead of me. Julian never mentioned agricultural science again. Not once in the 15 years since. That's how it worked. Not screaming, not violence, not anything you could point to and call abuse in a courtroom. Just a slow, patient dismantling of anything that made him someone other than exactly what our father needed. That's not an excuse for what he did to my daughter. I'm not offering you an excuse. I'm offering you an explanation, because the difference matters if you're trying to figure out who's actually dangerous in this situation and who's just been trained to be a weapon by someone more dangerous than he'll ever be. Elias's jaw tightened. My father has spent Julian's entire adult life making sure he understood exactly what happens to people who don't do what they're told. He watched it happen to me, or thought he did. He's grown up believing our father capable of killing his own son to protect an investment.
He's not wrong. I sat with that feeling something shift uncomfortably in my chest. The particular discomfort of having a clean villain complicated into something harder to hold on to with both hands. When our father says, "Handle it," Elias continued, Julian understands exactly what's actually being asked and exactly what happens if he refuses to do it. I'd put money on the fact that he hates himself considerably more than you hate him right now. And I'd put money on the fact that hating himself has never once been enough to make him stop. Are you telling me to feel sorry for him? I'm telling you, my brother is not a monster. He's a frightened man in his mid-30s, still following instructions handed to him by a 12-year-old's understanding of what happens if he doesn't. Elias looked down at his hands. I left him alone with our father for 9 years because staying alive myself felt like the only option I had. I think about that every single day. I think about what those 9 years did to him, without me there to absorb any of it alongside him. He's the one who hurt her, Elias. Not you. Not your father. Not directly. Not with his own hands. No, Elias agreed quietly. That part is entirely his. I'm not asking you to forgive it. I'm asking you to understand that if you want any chance of pulling my brother away from our father's grip, you're going to need to give him a door he actually believes he can walk through without being destroyed for trying. I thought about that for a long moment, about Naomi's description of Julian's face in the 4 seconds before he crossed the room. The particular defeat she'd described, watching happen in real time. What kind of door? I said. Elias was quiet for a moment, turning something over behind his eyes. The kind that doesn't require him to lose everything the moment he takes a single step through it. My father has made sure Julian believes there's no version of leaving that doesn't end with him losing Micah, losing Naomi, losing the only life he's ever known how to build. Fear that specific doesn't respond to threats or ultimatums. It only responds to someone proving carefully and patiently that the door is actually real. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed in my jacket pocket, and I pulled it out to find a message from Naomi, 3 words long, that changed the shape of everything we'd been discussing. Julian wants to talk. Alone. Julian's private plot sat 2 miles from the main Ashford estate, a small parcel he'd purchased under his own name 5 years earlier, separate enough from his father's holdings that I understood immediately why Naomi had chosen it as the meeting place. I left Elias at the shop with a promise to call once I understood what Julian actually wanted, and drove the winding county road with both hands tight on the wheel, running through every version of this conversation I could imagine, and discarding each one before I arrived. Julian was standing at the edge of his own vine rows when I pulled in, alone, no truck but his own visible anywhere on the property. His posture, the particular stillness of a man who had been waiting long enough to lose track of how long he'd actually been standing there. Mr. Okafor. His voice cracked slightly on my name. Thank you for coming. Naomi said you wanted to talk. Alone. I did. I do. Julian's hands moved to his jacket pocket, and I watched him close his fingers around something small. He didn't pull out, a habit I recognized without yet understanding it. I don't know how to start this in a way that doesn't sound like I'm asking for something I don't deserve to ask for. Then don't start there. Start with what happened. Julian looked out at his own vines, rows he'd clearly tended himself. The kind of careful attention that told me something about the man underneath, whatever his father had spent 35 years constructing on top of him. I noticed standing there how different this plot looked from the manicured perfection of the main Ashford estate. Rows a little uneven in places, pruned by hand rather than by hired crew. The particular imperfection of a man who did the work himself instead of directing someone else to do it for him. This is your land, I said, separate from your father's. I bought it 5 years ago. Told him it was an investment property, something to diversify the portfolio. Julian's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. It was the only lie I ever told him that he actually believed.
Completely. Because it was the only lie I told for a reason he understood. I needed one place that was entirely mine. I never told him the real reason. I'm not sure I fully understood it myself until right now, standing here with you. I didn't hurt Naomi because I wanted to, he said, and his voice had gone rough, unsteady. I need you to understand that first, even though I know it doesn't matter to you right now, even though I know it shouldn't. Your brother already told me some of this. Julian's head came up sharply. You found him. I found him this morning. Talked to him for over an hour. I watched something complicated move across Julian's face. Grief and relief tangled together in a way that told me he genuinely believed his brother dead this entire time. He didn't know that would surprise you this much? I've thought he was dead for 9 years, Mr. Okafor. I stood at his funeral. I've grieved him at his grave every year on the anniversary alone, because my father doesn't allow his name mentioned in the house. Julian's composure cracked further, his hand finally pulling the object from his pocket. A small dried piece of grapevine wood, worn smooth from years of being held. He taught me to prune my first vine with this exact cutting. I've carried it every day since the funeral. I didn't understand until just now why carrying it never made the grief feel any smaller. Because some part of you already suspected. Some part of me refused to let myself suspect anything, because suspecting meant admitting my father was capable of things I wasn't ready to admit he was capable of. Julian closed his fist around the wood knuckles whitening. I know what he's capable of now. I've known for 2 years, watching what he lets me become when Naomi doesn't do exactly what he expects of her. Tell me what happened Tuesday night. In your own words. Julian was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working the exact way Elias's had that morning. The family resemblance suddenly, uncomfortably clear. My father was in the room, he said finally. He told me to handle it. That's the phrase. Handle it. And I looked at Naomi, and I looked at my father, and I understood in about 4 seconds that refusing meant something worse would happen to her. Instead, something I wouldn't be there to control the shape of. That's not an answer, Julian. That's a justification. I know. His voice broke completely on the second word. I know exactly what it is. I've spent 2 days trying to find a version of the truth that doesn't sound exactly like what it actually is, and I can't find one because there isn't one. I hurt her because I was afraid of what my father would do if I didn't, and being afraid doesn't make what I did to her any less mine. He looked down at the piece of vine wood still clenched in his fist, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. I don't know how to fix this, he said. I don't even know if fixing it is something I get to want anymore. But I know I can't keep being the man my father built. Not after this. Not after watching Elias walk out of that shop this afternoon like a ghost who'd finally decided to stop haunting only himself. There's something else, Julian said, and reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, the same careful, deliberate motion I'd watched him use to pull out the vine wood minutes earlier. Something I found 4 months ago when my father asked me to retrieve documents from his home office while he was traveling in Seattle. He held out a small USB drive. Black plastic, unremarkable. The kind you could buy at any drugstore without anyone remembering the purchase. I wasn't looking for anything, Julian said. I want you to understand that. I wasn't investigating him. I was doing exactly what he asked, pulling closing documents for a property transfer, and I found a folder that shouldn't have existed on that particular drive. Encrypted. Buried 3 directories deep where he clearly never expected anyone to look. You broke the encryption. I know computers better than he thinks I do. It's one of the only things I never mentioned learning, because I understood even then, some part of me understood that a skill he didn't know about might be a skill worth having someday. Julian's hand trembled slightly as he held the drive out further. Inside was 7 years of transactions. Every payment made to keep a property dispute quiet. every filing that got misplaced on purpose, every county official who took money to look the other way when one of my father's acquisitions didn't hold up to scrutiny. I took the drive from him, surprised at how light something so consequential could actually be. Why didn't you go to the authorities 4 months ago? Because I was afraid, Mr. Okafor, exactly the way I've been afraid my entire adult life. And because I didn't yet understand that being afraid was going to cost someone else more than it was costing me. Julian's voice cracked on the last word. I copied the files. I kept them here in this building, on this land, because it was the one place my father never bothered to look closely. He owns this parcel on paper, technically, but he considers it beneath his attention. A hobby project he indulges because it keeps me occupied and out of the way. You've had this for 4 months.
4 months and 11 days.
Julian looked directly at me for the first time since I'd arrived. I kept telling myself I was waiting for the right moment, the right proof, the right person to bring it to. I understand now that I was actually just waiting for something to force my hand because I didn't trust myself to do the harder thing on my own. What would have forced your hand if Tuesday night hadn't? Julian was quiet for a moment, considering the question with more honesty than I expected. I don't know. I've asked myself that every night since I found the drive. I think, if I'm honest, I think I would have kept waiting indefinitely. Kept telling myself, next month, next season, next time something changes. Fear like that doesn't resolve itself on a timeline. It just waits for something to break it open from the outside. This is the something. This is the something. He exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders for the first time since I'd arrived. I don't know everything that's on it. I know enough to know it's substantial. Bank records, correspondence, names of officials I recognized from the county courthouse, from the sheriff's department, people my father has been quietly compensating for years to keep every acquisition running smoothly. Kessler. Kessler's name appears more than once. Julian's jaw tightened. Along with 2 people at the county recorder's office, and someone in Olympia I didn't recognize at first, until I looked into who currently oversees state investigative resource allocation for this region. I thought of Cruz, of her mention of a contact in the capital, who'd made 2 calls to quietly bury her funding requests, and felt something cold and clarifying move through my chest. This is what she needs, I said mostly to myself. This is the financial spine she's been missing. Who? Renata Cruz, state investigator. She's been building a case against your father for 20 months and hasn't been able to land anything solid enough to hold. I looked at the drive in my hand, then back at Julian, seeing him fully now, not as the man who'd hurt my daughter, but as the frightened, complicated person underneath that failure, still capable of choosing something better, even this late. This might be enough to finally give her that. What happens to me once you hand that over? I don't know, I said honestly. I'm not going to lie to you about that. Whatever comes, comes. But I don't think you handed me 4 months of hidden proof because you were hoping to avoid consequences, Julian. I think you handed it to me because some part of you has been waiting to stop being the man capable of avoiding them. Julian nodded slowly, and something in his expression settled into a kind of grim, exhausted resolve. Then take it, he said. And Mr. Okafor, whatever happens after this, whatever it costs me, I need you to tell Naomi something for me. Tell her I finally understood what she was trying to leave. And I understood it too late to be the one who saved her from it. I put the drive in my jacket pocket next to Cruz's card and drove back toward the highway with my grandson's father's confession still ringing in my ears. Uncertain for the first time in days whether I'd just witnessed a man beginning to save himself or simply watched him finish drowning. More honestly than before, Dorothy's call came in before I'd made it halfway back to my own property, and something in her voice told me she already sensed the day had shifted into a different gear entirely. "I need you to come to my house," she said. "Tonight, if you can manage it. There's something I should have shown you from the start, instead of just describing it over the phone." She lived on a quiet street on the edge of town. A small, well-kept house with a detached garage that had clearly been converted into something other than a place to park a car. She met me at the door, still wearing her reading glasses pushed up into gray hair that had come loose from its pins over the course of what had evidently been a long day of her own. "Through here," she said, leading me past the kitchen and out a side door into the garage. A single work light hung from the rafters, illuminating a large wooden trunk pushed against the back wall. The kind of trunk that looked like it had been built to survive considerably longer than any of the secrets currently living inside it. 12 years of ledgers," Dorothy said, kneeling to unlatch it. "I kept photocopies of everything I processed for Ashford Estate. Every transaction I found even slightly irregular, filed by date and cross-referenced by property. I told myself for years I was keeping them for my own protection, in case Cormac ever decided my usefulness had expired. I understand now I was keeping them for exactly this moment, whether I admitted that to myself or not." "Every folder is a property," Dorothy said, running her fingers along the tabs without pulling any of them out, yet like she needed a moment to acknowledge what they represented before handing them over. "Dates of acquisition. The shell company used the pressure applied beforehand when a family didn't want to sell. Some of it's subtle, financing that mysteriously stopped renewing. Some of it isn't." She pulled one folder halfway out, then pushed it back in as if she'd decided I didn't need to see that particular one yet. Not tonight. Not on top of everything else. "The Delacroix fire is in here. So is a family named Restrepo, who lost 60 acres over a water rights dispute that never should have existed. You kept all of this for 12 years and never once considered walking away." "I considered it constantly. I told myself I was doing more good staying close enough to eventually understand the whole picture than I would have done leaving in protest and understanding nothing." Dorothy's mouth tightened. "I've had a long time to decide whether that was wisdom or cowardice dressed up as patience. I still don't have a clean answer." "I have something else," I said, and pulled the USB drive from my jacket pocket. "Julian gave it to me an hour ago. 7 years of transactions his father kept encrypted on a home office drive. Kessler's name is on it. So is someone in Olympia." Dorothy went very still, her hand pausing on the edge of the trunk. "Julian gave you this." "Willingly. He's been sitting on it for 4 months, working up the courage to do something with it." I held the drive out to her. "I think between your 12 years and his 7, we might finally have enough to give Cruz the financial spine she's been missing." Dorothy took the drive with both hands, the way you'd take something considerably heavier than its actual weight. "I need to call her," she said. "Right now, before either of us loses our nerve about what happens after tonight." I dialed Cruz from the garage, put the phone on speaker, and watched Dorothy's face while I explained what we had. Cruz was quiet through most of it, the particular silence of a person doing careful math rather than simply listening. "Bring both to me tonight," Cruz said finally, her voice tighter than that afternoon in the diner. "Not tomorrow, tonight. If what you're describing is accurate, this is the first time in 20 months I've had anything resembling a complete financial trail." "You think he already suspects?" "I think Kessler stopping you yesterday and Cormac visiting you himself means someone in that organization already understands the walls are closing in, even if they don't yet understand from which direction." A pause, papers shuffling somewhere on her end. "I need you to understand something else, Mr. Okafor. Once I have this evidence formally logged, the timeline accelerates. Cormac's attorneys are good. If they sense movement before I'm ready to act, they'll start filing motions to slow everything down before I can bring charges that actually stick." "What do you need from us specifically?" "Discretion, mostly. and patience for a few more days, which I recognize as asking a great deal of a man whose daughter is currently sleeping in his living room with broken ribs. Cruz exhaled audibly. Once I have both sets of records cross-referenced, I'll need corroborating testimony. Dorothy, are you prepared to go on record formally, not just hand over documents anonymously?
Dorothy's chin lifted, the particular steadiness of a woman who had already made peace with the answer. I've spent 12 years being useful to the wrong man in the wrong way. I would like whatever's left of my usefulness to finally count for something else.
Dorothy set the trunk's photocopied ledgers into 2 cardboard boxes with steady, practiced hands, the particular efficiency of a woman finally allowed to finish something she'd started years earlier.
How long until you're ready?
I asked.
Days, not weeks, if this is what I think it is. Cruz's voice carried something I hadn't heard from her before, a controlled kind of urgency. But Mr. Okafor, I need you to keep your family close and keep your guard up until this is over. A man like Cormac Ashford doesn't go quietly once he understands the walls have actually started closing in around him. Cruz called a meeting at my kitchen table 2 days later, once the ledgers in the drive had been formally logged into evidence. And she arrived with a plan that required something none of the paperwork alone could provide. Naomi sat at the far end of the table, healing enough now to hold herself without wincing every time she shifted position, though the caution in her movements hadn't fully disappeared and probably wouldn't for weeks yet. She'd insisted on being part of this conversation, and I hadn't found a good enough reason to argue against it, given everything the past week had already asked of her without her consent. I have the financial trail now, she said, spreading a single page across my table, a timeline written in her own careful hand. What I don't have is a public trigger, something that forces Cormac to react visibly in a way that shows this county what's actually been happening behind his donor plaques and his ribbon cuttings. Paperwork convicts him eventually, Mr. Okafor. It doesn't convince the people who've spent a decade believing he's the best thing that ever happened to this valley. You want Elias to show himself. I want Elias to force a moment nobody in this county can look away from. Cruz turned to him, where he sat quiet at the end of the table, still uneasy in a kitchen that wasn't his own after 9 years of avoiding rooms exactly like it. There's a county agricultural council meeting Thursday evening. Public, live-streamed open floor for community concerns. Cormac's scheduled to speak about the Harvest Festival sponsorship. If you walk into that room, Elias, alive, in front of witnesses and cameras, he cannot control the narrative the way he's controlled every other version of this story for 9 years. Why does it need to be public? Why not simply arrest him once the evidence is filed? Because men like Cormac Ashford have spent decades building relationships with exactly the kind of people who decide whether an arrest sticks or quietly dissolves into a settlement nobody hears about. Cruz's voice hardened slightly. I need this county to see what he's built, not just read a summary in a court filing 6 months from now that half of them will dismiss as politically motivated. Visibility protects the case as much as the paperwork does. Elias was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee mug slowly between both hands. If I walk into that room, he said, there's no walking back out of it as Raymond Coburn ever again. Whatever happens after Thursday, that part of my life is finished the second I open that door. I understand what I'm asking. Do you? His voice wasn't sharp exactly, just weighted with 9 years of caution. Cruz's plan was asking him to abandon in a single evening. I've spent 9 years making sure my father never had reason to look for me twice. The moment I stand in that room, I become the single loudest threat to everything he's built. And I understand better than anyone here what he's willing to do to loud threats. You'll have protection, Cruz said. State presence, plainclothes, positioned before you ever walk in. Protection didn't save Dale Whitcomb, Elias said quietly. And the room went still around that name, a debt none of us at that table could fully understand, except him. I watched him sit with the decision,
The particular stillness of a man doing math with his own life on one side of the equation and everyone else's safety on the other. Naomi had told me once that courage wasn't the absence of fear, just the decision to move forward anyway. And I watched Elias make exactly that decision in real time, his jaw tightening the way I'd seen Julian's tighten. The family resemblance surfacing again in a moment that had nothing to do with genetics and everything to do with finally choosing differently than fear alone would have chosen.
"I'll do it," he said. "Thursday. But I want Julian there too if he's willing. My father built 2 sons into weapons against each other for 9 years. I think it matters if we're both standing in that room when it finally breaks."
Cruz nodded slowly, already recalculating something behind her careful expression. "I'll need to coordinate additional coverage if Julian's involved. Given his position inside the family, his presence changes the risk calculation considerably. It also strengthens the visual immeasurably. 2 sons standing together against everything their father spent 30 years building. "I'll call him," I said, reaching for my phone. He should hear this from someone, not read about it after the fact. I dialed Julian's number and it rang 4 times before going to voicemail, which struck me as unremarkable, until I tried again 10 minutes later and got the same result. By the 3rd attempt, unease had settled into something heavier in my chest, and I looked up to find Naomi standing in the kitchen doorway, her phone in her hand, her face gone the particular pale I'd learned over the past week to recognize as genuine alarm rather than ordinary worry. "Dad," she said, "Julian's not answering. He was supposed to call an hour ago, and he's not answering, and I just got a text from a number I don't recognize that only says one thing." She turned the screen toward me. 3 words. No punctuation. No signature. He knows everything. I looked at Cruz across the table, and whatever calm professionalism she'd carried into my kitchen 20 minutes earlier had sharpened into something considerably more urgent. "Who sent that?" Cruz said, already reaching for her own phone. "Unknown number. Naomi doesn't recognize it." I stood my chair scraping back against the floor louder than I intended. Julian was supposed to be safe until Thursday. That was the whole point of waiting. "Someone accelerated the timeline," Cruz said grimly, already dialing. And it wasn't us. Elias had gone very still at the end of the table, his coffee forgotten, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The specific stillness of a man who had spent 9 years dreading a version of exactly this moment. Cruz had her answer within the hour, and it arrived through a contact inside the sheriff's department she'd apparently been cultivating for longer than she'd let on. A deputy who still believed enough in the badge to make a quiet phone call when something crossed a line even he understood was wrong. "Kessler picked Julian up 2 hours ago," Cruz said, standing in my kitchen with her phone still in her hand, her voice carrying a controlled urgency that frightened me more than shouting would have. "Officially, it's a welfare check. Unofficially, my contact says Kessler drove him somewhere that isn't the county jail, isn't the sheriff's office, isn't anywhere on the normal booking route." "Where?" I said. "The old storage warehouse behind Ashford Estate's original tasting room. The building they stopped using for wine production 15 years ago when the new facility opened." Cruz's jaw tightened. "My contact says it's the place Cormac uses when he wants something to disappear quietly. No cameras, no regular staff, just concrete walls and a padlock most people in this county have never had reason to think twice about." Naomi made a sound I hadn't heard her make since the night she arrived on my porch. Something between a gasp and a word that didn't quite finish forming. "He's putting Julian in the warehouse," she said, her voice cracking. "Dad, that's where he sends things he wants to control. I've heard him mention it exactly once, years ago, and Julian went white when he said it. He wouldn't tell me why." I thought about that moment more times than I can count over the past 2 days, and I never once let myself finish the thought all the way through. "What did he say about it exactly?" "Almost nothing.
just that his father kept things there he'd decided didn't exist anymore. Naomi wrapped her arms around herself. I asked what kind of things. He changed the subject so fast, I understood I wasn't supposed to ask again. I was already reaching for my truck keys when Elias's hand closed around my wrist. Firm, steady, the grip of a man who understood something about his father that I still didn't. Raymond, he said, using the name I'd only ever heard from Naomi. If we go in there without authorization, without Cruz's team behind us, everything we've built collapses. My father's attorneys will have a field day with 2 civilians trespassing during an active investigation. Your brother could be in danger right now. I understand that better than you do. Elias's grip tightened. But if we hand him even one procedural mistake, he uses it to unravel everything downstream. Everything Julian risked handing over. Everything Dorothy's spent 12 years documenting. We do this the way that actually protects him, not the way that feels fastest. Cruz was already dialing, her voice dropping into the flat, precise register I recognized from our first meeting at the diner. I need a state-level authorization, she said into the phone, pacing my kitchen floor. Signed by a judge outside Benton County, someone with zero connection to Ashford or the sheriff's department. Yes, tonight. I have reasonable grounds to believe an active witness is being illegally detained in connection with an ongoing state investigation. I stood at my own kitchen counter, hands flat against the tile, the way I'd stood there the night Naomi arrived, and felt the specific helplessness of understanding exactly what needed to happen and being told, correctly, that I couldn't be the one to make it happen fastest. How long? I asked, when Cruz finally lowered the phone. I have a judge in Chelan County who owes me a favor and doesn't sleep much. Authorization should be signed within the hour. Cruz's eyes were hard-focused. I have a team staged 2 counties over, on standby, for exactly this escalation. Once authorization comes through, we move immediately, not before. And if an hour is too long, Cruz didn't answer that directly, which told me everything. Her silence wasn't willing to say. Raymond? Elias said quietly, still holding my wrist like an anchor. My brother spent 4 months finding the courage to hand you that drive. He didn't do that to die in a warehouse before anyone got to use it. Trust the process Cruz is building. It's the only version of tonight that ends with all of us still standing when the sun comes up. I looked at the clock on my kitchen wall. Watched the second hand complete a full rotation while none of us spoke, and understood that the next 60 minutes were going to feel considerably longer than any hour I'd lived through since the night my daughter arrived soaked and broken in my vineyard rows. Dorothy called twice during that hour, her voice tight with the same helpless urgency the rest of us were fighting to contain, offering to drive over to do something, anything, rather than sit alone imagining the worst. I told her to stay put, to keep her phone close, and heard in her silence the frustration of a woman who had spent 12 years being useful, indirectly, and desperately wanted for once to be useful directly. Naomi sat at the kitchen table, with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she wasn't drinking, her eyes fixed on the middle distance, and I recognized in her stillness an echo of my own. The night she'd first appeared on my porch. Elias stood near the window, watching the dark road outside like he expected headlights at any moment. His own history with hidden places apparently sharper than any of us fully understood. At 41 minutes past the hour, Cruz's phone rang. She answered before the first ring finished, listened for perhaps 15 seconds, and I watched her posture straighten with resolve. Authorization signed, she said, already moving toward the door. My team is 30 minutes out from the warehouse. Everyone stay exactly where you are until I call again. This is the part where discipline matters more than speed. The County Agricultural Council meeting had been scheduled for weeks before any of us knew Julian would be sitting in a warehouse while it happened. And there was no version of that night where postponing it made sense.
Not with Cruz's team already 30 minutes out and closing. Elias insisted on going anyway. I drove him myself, both of us silent for most of the ride. The community center's parking lot, filling with the ordinary Thursday evening traffic of farmers and council members, and a handful of local reporters who had no idea they were about to witness something considerably larger than a Harvest Festival sponsorship discussion. "You don't have to do this tonight," I said, parking near the entrance. "Not with everything happening at the warehouse." "That's exactly why I have to do it tonight," Elias said, his hand already on the door handle. "If Julian's in danger because my father's cornered, the last thing that helps him is my father having one more hour to feel like he's still controlling every version of this story. He needs to understand, right now, tonight, that the story already got away from him." I studied him for a moment, in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. This man who had spent 9 years perfecting the art of not being seen, now preparing to make himself more visible than he'd been in nearly a decade. "Are you ready for this?" I asked. "No," Elias said simply. "I don't think there's a version of Ready available for something like this. I've rehearsed walking through that door 1,000 times in my head over 9 years. And every single rehearsal ends differently. And none of them prepared me for how my hands are shaking right now." He looked down at them, steadied them deliberately against his knees. "I'm doing it anyway. That's the only kind of ready that's actually going to matter tonight." We walked in together, and I watched Elias straighten his shoulders in the doorway, the way a man does before stepping into water he knows will be cold. The meeting room was half-full folding chairs, arranged in rows facing a small stage where the county council sat behind a long table, Cormac Ashford. Seated among invited speakers near the podium, silver-haired and composed, mid-sentence about the Harvest Festival's economic impact on local vendors. He saw Elias the moment we crossed the threshold. I watched it happen in real time. The particular collapse of a man's entire practiced composure in the space of a single breath. Cormac's mouth kept moving for perhaps 2 more words before the sound simply stopped. His hand frozen halfway toward the water glass he'd been reaching for. His pale eyes locked on his son's face, with an expression I had never once seen him wear in any of our previous encounters. Not calculation, not the careful assessment he'd given me on my own porch. Just raw, unguarded shock. The specific expression of a man confronting something his mind had spent 9 years insisting was impossible. The room noticed the silence before it noticed why. Heads turned. A council member said Mr. Ashford's name once, gently, the way you'd prompt someone who'd simply lost their train of thought. Cormac didn't answer. He was still staring at Elias, who stood at the back of the room, without moving, without approaching, letting his father's own face do the only work that mattered. Someone near the front had their phone out, recording the instinctive reflex of a generation that filmed everything unusual before understanding what they were actually filming. I saw the moment other phones followed a ripple of small screens rising across the room like a field catching wind. A woman 2 rows ahead of me leaned toward her neighbor and whispered something I couldn't hear, though I imagined it was some version of the same question moving through every mind in that room. "Isn't that Elias Ashford? Wasn't he?" Cormac stood up slowly, one hand braced against the table, and for the first time since I'd met him, his composure didn't reassemble itself the way it always had before. He opened his mouth, once closed it, and simply walked out through the side door without a word to anyone. Without the smooth, unhurried exit I'd watched him execute on my own porch days earlier. This time he moved fast. Too fast. The pace of a man whose calculations had finally, completely failed him. The door swung shut behind him, and for a moment, the room held itself in a strange, uncertain quiet. Nobody entirely sure what they had just watched, or whether it was over. A council member cleared his throat and said something about a short recess, his voice carrying the particular unease of a man trying to restore normalcy to a room that had just watched normalcy leave through a side door.
Elias didn't follow. He stood exactly where he'd been standing, watching the door his father had disappeared through, his hands loose at his sides, now no longer shaking. Somewhere behind us, a folding chair creaked as someone shifted their weight. The overhead fluorescents hummed faintly, the particular sound of a room built for ordinary business, now holding something it had never been designed to hold. I heard my own breath slow and careful, and said nothing. Because there are moments a man needs simply to stand inside, without being asked to explain what he's feeling.
My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Cruz, 3 words that pulled the room's strange stillness apart and replaced it with an entirely different kind of urgency.
Warrant executed. Moving in.
I looked at Elias, still standing motionless near the door, and felt the full weight of 2 crises converging in the same 15 minutes. One resolving in a community center full of strangers and cell phones, the other unfolding in the dark somewhere behind a padlocked warehouse door where my daughter's husband was still waiting to learn which version of that night he'd survive into. I drove straight from the community center to the address Cruz had texted me, arriving to find the old warehouse lot lit up with the harsh white glow of portable floodlights. 3 unmarked vehicles angled across the gravel entrance and a padlocked chain-link gate already standing open.
Cruz met me at the perimeter, her badge visible, now clipped to her jacket. Her earlier caution about visibility apparently no longer necessary now that the warrant had been executed.
"Stay behind the tape line," she said, already turning back toward the building. "My team is inside. I need you here, not in there, until we've confirmed the scene is secure."
Is he alive? We don't know yet. We're 30 seconds from finding out. Something in her voice, usually so carefully controlled, cracked slightly at the edges. "I need you to let us do our job, Mr. Okafor. I understand exactly how difficult that is right now." I stood behind the yellow tape with my hands shoved deep in my jacket pockets, watching flashlight beams cross behind the warehouse's grimy windows, watching shadows move with the particular urgency of trained people executing a plan they'd rehearsed but never fully trusted would go smoothly. The building itself looked smaller than the danger it represented. A plain concrete structure with a rusted metal door. The kind of place that existed in every rural county, unremarkable enough that nobody thought to ask what it actually held. Minutes passed. I counted them by my own pulse, which felt louder in my ears than it had any right to be. I thought of Naomi waiting at my house with Dorothy and Elias, the 3 of them holding vigil over a phone that hadn't rung in what must have felt like hours by now. I thought of Micah asleep upstairs, unaware that this particular night was deciding the shape of the rest of his family's life while he slept. I thought absurdly of the vineyard rows behind my own house, dark and quiet, and utterly indifferent to everything happening 40 minutes away, and found something almost steadying in that indifference. The reminder that some things simply continued, regardless of what any of us survived or didn't. The metal door opened. A figure emerged, supported between 2 officers, moving slowly, unsteadily, but moving under his own power, which told me more in that single detail than any words could have. Julian's face was pale, his hands zip-tied loosely in front of him, for processing rather than restraint. His eyes finding mine across the lot with an expression I recognized, because I'd worn a version of it myself the night his wife arrived on my porch. "He's stable," Cruz called back to me, already moving to meet the officers halfway. Cold, dehydrated, but stable. Kessler left him in an unheated section of the building, no serious physical harm beyond exposure. I ducked under the tape before anyone could stop me, and nobody did Cruz's earlier caution apparently softening now that the scene had resolved itself safely. Julian looked up as I approached, and something in his face, exhausted and frightened, and still somehow relieved,
made my chest tighten with an emotion considerably more complicated than the anger I'd carried toward him only days earlier.
Mr. Okafor. His voice came out rough, cracked from cold.
I wasn't sure anyone would come in time.
We came, I said.
Cruz had a team standing by before Kessler ever picked you up.
I didn't know that.
I sat in there for 2 hours not knowing that. Julian's shoulders sagged, some enormous weight finally allowed to settle. Kessler kept asking me questions about the drive, about what I'd told you, what I'd told Cruz. I didn't answer any of it. I want you to know that. Whatever else I've gotten wrong, I didn't give him anything.
You didn't need to give him anything, I said.
We already had everything we needed. That's exactly why he panicked enough to do this.
An officer approached with a foil emergency blanket, wrapping it around Julian's shoulders
with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd done this exact task many times before. Julian pulled it tight around himself, still shivering, and looked past me toward the warehouse door with an expression that had shifted from fear into something harder, more resolved.
There's more, he said. More than what was on the drive. I found additional files while I waited in there on my phone before Kessler took it. I need to give them to Cruz before anything else happens tonight. Cruz appeared at my elbow, notebook already open. Her earlier urgency replaced now by the focused calm of a woman closing in on the last thing she needed.
What kind of files, Julian?
Direct correspondence,
Julian said, his voice steadying with each word, like the act of speaking the truth out loud was itself a kind of warmth returning to his body. My father, in his own words, ordering Kessler to detain me tonight, specifically to find out what I'd already told you. He wrote it in a text message, Ms. Cruz, thinking a phone was safer than a phone call. He was wrong.
Cruz's pen stopped moving mid-sentence, and I watched 20 months of patient, frustrated investigation finally arrive somewhere solid enough to stand on.
I'll need your phone processed properly, she said. Chain of custody, everything documented. But Julian, this could be the piece that turns pattern evidence into an airtight case. Direct instruction, in his own words, ordering illegal detention to obstruct an active investigation. She closed her notebook slowly, something that might have been the beginning of relief crossing her otherwise disciplined expression. This is what I've been building toward for 20 months. You just handed it to me, standing in a parking lot in a foil blanket.
Julian let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his lungs.
The particular exhale of a man setting down something he'd been carrying far longer than just tonight.
Then it was worth it, he said quietly.
Whatever happens to me now, if that's what finally stops him, then sitting in that cold building for 2 hours was worth every minute of it.
Cruz's phone rang while she was still documenting Julian's statement,
and I watched her expression shift as she listened. The particular stillness of a professional receiving news she'd worked 20 months to earn the right to hear.
They have him, she said, lowering the phone slowly.
State police intercepted Cormac's vehicle 11 miles from the community center. He was driving toward the airport in Pasco, apparently attempting to reach a private charter before anyone could formalize charges against him.
He's in custody,
as of 4 minutes ago. Cruz's composure cracked just slightly enough to show me the exhaustion and relief underneath 20 months of careful, patient work. Obstruction of justice, witness tampering, and a preliminary list of financial crimes charges that my office will be finalizing over the next several days, once we've fully processed everything you, Dorothy, and Julian have given us tonight.
What about Kessler? Already in a separate interview room, already talking from what I'm hearing.
Cruz allowed herself something close to a tired smile. Men like Kessler build their entire careers on loyalty, as long as loyalty is convenient. The moment it stops being convenient, that loyalty tends to evaporate remarkably fast. I expect he'll have given up most of what he knows before sunrise, purely out of self-preservation.
And the officials on the drive, the ones in Olympia, those will take longer. State-level corruption cases always do. And I won't pretend 20 months of work ends cleanly in a single night. Cruz closed her notebook fully, now tucking it under her arm. But the foundation exists now in a way it never has before. That's not nothing, Mr. Okafor. That's actually everything.
Julian sat very still on the tailgate of an ambulance, the foil blanket still wrapped around his shoulders, and something moved across his face that I couldn't fully name. Grief and relief tangled together, the way I imagined they might stay tangled for a long time yet.
It's actually over, he said, mostly to himself. I've been afraid of this exact night for so long that I don't entirely know how to occupy the space where the fear used to be.
It's not entirely over, Cruz said gently. There will be court proceedings, testimony. Your own legal situation regarding the incident with your wife will need to be addressed separately, and I won't pretend that part is going to be simple or painless. But the larger machine your father built, the one that's been quietly destroying families in this valley for over a decade, that machine stopped running 11 miles from here, about 5 minutes ago. Julian nodded slowly, and something in his expression settled into an acceptance that looked older than his 35 years. The particular weariness of a man finally allowed to stop running calculations about consequences he'd been dreading for far longer than just tonight. I know what's coming for me, he said quietly. I've known since the moment I handed Mr. Okafor that drive. I'm not asking anyone to soften it. I just needed it to actually be real first. Needed my father to actually stop before I could let myself think about what happens to me next. I called Naomi from the parking lot, my hands steady in a way I hadn't expected, after everything the night had asked of them. She answered on the first ring, her voice tight with the particular fear of someone who had been waiting too long for news that might not be good. Dad. He's safe, I said. Julian's safe. Cold, exhausted, but safe. And Cormac's in custody. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that I thought the call might have dropped. And then I heard her exhale, long and shaking, the sound of someone finally allowed to set down something impossibly heavy. Is it really over? She said. The part that could have hurt any of you tonight is over, I said carefully, unwilling to promise her more certainty than the situation actually contained. The rest of it, the parts that take longer to heal, that's still ahead of us. But tonight, yes, tonight, it's over. And Julian. I looked over at him, still sitting on the ambulance tailgate, staring at nothing in particular, with the specific exhaustion of a man who had survived something, and was only beginning to understand what surviving it would actually cost him. He'll face consequences, I said. Real ones. But he's the reason Cruz had what she needed tonight, Naomi. Whatever happens to him legally, that part matters. And I think it should matter to you, too, whenever you're ready to let it. After I hung up, I walked away from the floodlights and the remaining officers, and the particular chaos of a scene still being processed, and found a quiet stretch of gravel near the edge of the lot, where the darkness hadn't yet been chased away by portable generators. I stood there for a while, not thinking about anything in particular, just breathing the cold night air and listening to the distant sound of radios crackling behind me. Voices confirming details, closing out a case that had taken 20 months and one broken family to finally crack open. Somewhere above the valley, stars were visible in a way they rarely were near the estate's landscaped grounds, and I looked up at them without any real thought behind the looking. Just the simple animal relief of a body finally allowed to stop bracing for the next blow. A breeze moved through the dark rows of some distant vineyard I couldn't see, carrying the faint mineral smell of cold soil and crushed grape skins left over from the harvest. I stood there a long while, hands loose at my sides, and let the night hold me the way it hadn't been able to hold anyone in this valley for a very long time. Somewhere behind me an engine started, then another. The sounds of a scene beginning its slow return to ordinary. I did not turn around yet, I simply stood there a while longer, letting the cold settle into my hands, letting the quiet finish whatever work it still needed to do before I let myself walk back toward everyone waiting for me. 6 days after that night in the warehouse parking lot, I woke before dawn out of habit rather than necessity, and walked out to the vineyard the way I had every morning for 40 years before any of this began. Before I understood how much a single family could hide behind good manners and a well-kept lawn. The frost had come early that week, the way it does most Octobers in this valley, and I crouched at the edge of row 11 and took a handful of soil the way I always had, cold and slightly resistant, not yet fully surrendered to winter. I held it a long moment, longer than the habit actually required, feeling the particular texture of ground that had survived one more hard season. And something in my chest loosened slightly, the way it does when a thing you've been bracing against finally settles into something you can hold instead of just endure. I stayed crouched there longer than I meant to, one hand still pressed flat against the cold earth, not thinking about anything in particular. I did not think about Cormac or Kessler, or the 20 months of quiet damage Cruz was still working to fully uncover. I simply knelt there in the gray early light, feeling the ground hold still beneath my palm the way it always had. The one constant in a week that had rearranged nearly everything else. I thought I understood about my own family. A crow called somewhere down toward the creek. The soil warmed faintly where my hand had been resting against it. Some small transfer of heat neither of us could keep for long. I stayed like that until my knees ached from the cold, and did not move until I was ready to, which was its own kind of answer to a question I hadn't let myself ask directly yet. Naomi found me there 20 minutes later, moving more freely, now most of the visible bruising faded, though I noticed she still favored her left side slightly when she reached too far or turned too fast. "You've been out here a while," she said, not quite a question. Needed to think. I let the soil fall from my palm, watched it scatter across the row. "Cruz called this morning. Said the case is moving forward properly now. Kessler's cooperating fully. 2 of the county officials from Julian's files have already resigned rather than face what's coming. And Cormac denied bail. His attorneys are good, but even good attorneys have limits when the evidence includes his own voice on a recording, ordering someone detained illegally." I looked at my daughter, healing, changed, carrying something in her now that hadn't been there before all of this started. "It's not over, Naomi. Not the parts that matter most, but the machine that hurt you. It stopped running." She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the rows the way I did most mornings, searching for something in the pattern of vines that neither of us could have named out loud. "Julian called yesterday," she said finally. "From the detention facility." I almost didn't answer. "But you did." "I did." Her voice was careful, measured, the tone of someone still working out how much of a feeling she was actually allowed to have. "He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't ask for anything, really. He just wanted me to know the love was real, even with everything else that happened being true at the same time. I don't know what to do with that yet. I don't know if I'm supposed to do anything with it right now." "You're not supposed to do anything with it right now," I said. "Not today. Maybe not for a long while yet." Later that afternoon, Micah found me in the workshop, sanding down a cabinet door I'd been neglecting since the night everything started, and climbed up on the stool beside mine, without asking the particular confidence of a child who has learned over one very long week that some adults in his life could still be trusted completely. "I want to show you something," he said, and unfolded a piece of paper from his back pocket, smoothed flat against the workbench between us. It was the vineyard drawing the one he'd shown Cormac weeks earlier. Rows of vines in careful colored pencil, roots drawn dark beneath the soil line, the way Elias had taught him. And in the corner, the gray, unfinished patch of ground he'd left blank for so long was no longer gray. He'd filled it in with green, uneven in places, a child's careful attempt at matching the color of everything around it.
I finished it, he said simply. Chu-Ray helped me pick the right color. He said real vineyards take a long time to grow right, and it's okay if the new part looks a little different from the old part for a while. I looked at the drawing a long moment, at the small, imperfect patch of green filled in after weeks of staying empty, and felt something move through my chest that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite relief, but lived somewhere between the two, aching the same as both.
"He's right," I said, my voice rougher than I intended. "It's supposed to look a little different for a while. That's how you know something new is actually growing there." Elias had stayed on at the estate this past week, helping Cruz's team sort through the property's records. A strange and complicated homecoming none of us quite knew how to name yet. He'd started coming by my place most evenings, after standing at the edge of my own vineyard rows, the way a man does when remembering something he'd deliberately forced himself to forget for 9 years. I found him there that evening, watching the last light drop behind the tree line, and stood beside him without speaking, the particular silence two men share when words would only get in the way of something already understood.
"It doesn't feel like winning," he said eventually.
"I thought it would feel more like winning."
"It rarely does," I said.
"Not the kind that costs what this one cost." The last time I saw Elias that autumn, he was standing at the edge of the old rows behind the main estate house, the ones his grandfather had planted, the ones that had waited 9 years for someone who actually belonged to them to come back and read the soil again. He didn't say much. He knelt down, took a handful of dirt, and let it fall slowly through his fingers, watching it land without watching where it landed. I used to believe silence was a kind of shelter. I believed it the way my own father believed it, watching another man's hands take what belonged to him, and calling his own stillness wisdom instead of what it actually was. I taught myself, without ever meaning to, that staying quiet was how a person survived what he couldn't change. I carried that belief for 62 years before a knock came at 1:30 in the morning and asked me to set it down. What I understand now, standing in my own vineyard at the start of a new season, is that silence never actually protected anyone. It only delayed the cost and let it compound in the dark until someone I loved had to pay a debt I should have settled years earlier. Naomi is healing. Julian is answering for what he did in a room I am not allowed to soften for him. Elias is learning how to be alive again in front of people instead of behind a borrowed name. None of it is finished. But the ground remembers everything you plant in it, good and bad both, and it does not lie about which one you chose. If I could say one thing to every father watching his own family from a careful distance, hoping the distance itself counts as love, I would tell him this: love that only watches is not yet love. It is only the beginning of it, waiting for you to finally act. God does not always clear the field before you're asked to walk into it. Sometimes, He simply puts the right people in your path and asks whether you'll finally stop waiting for someone else to move first. He put Earl's courage in mine, Dorothy's 12 years of quiet guilt, Cruz's 20 months of patience, a 9-year-old girl's stubborn faith that her grandfather would eventually understand. None of them owed me any of it. They gave it anyway. Because the right thing has a way of finding people ready to stand up when the moment finally arrives. So here is my question for you. The one I never let myself ask honestly until it was almost too late. If someone you loved was drowning quietly in front of you, would you finally say something? Tell me in the comments about someone who broke their own silence for you. Share this with a father who still believes distance is the same thing as protection. And if these stories still have a place in your week, stay close. There are more still worth telling.